Welcome back, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt. Haviv Rettig Gur is the senior analyst for the Times of Israel, a monthly guest here since the long war began for Israel after October 7th, 2023. And we have not yet talked since Operation Rising Lion began and ended. Haviv, welcome back. Thank you for spending time with me. Big opening question. What is the impact of Operation Rising Lion on the general Israeli psyche, if you can even venture such a bold statement?
Yeah, that's an easy one. The war itself had tremendous support. Not all wars do. It depends a lot on whether there's a sense that they're successful, whether they're dragging. This was a war that the general Israeli population, I mean, huge majorities, think that Iran really does want to destroy them, wants to kill them, and the military forces, security forces pulled off some astonishing successes, very low cost. There have been something like 29 dead. There have been some buildings that fell from the larger rockets that Iran fired. Very low cost for Israel, very low cost for Iranian civilians, for example, considering what everyone thought this war would be, and tremendously successful targeting the regime. So it's I don't know how to put it. It's a thrill in the sense that all the bad things about a war are minimized, and the very thing we needed, which was the sense to explain to the enemy that they cannot have this sort of Damocles and promise of genocide hanging over us for a generation without us responding. Those things were achieved, and so tremendous, I think, sense of relief and sense of success.
So I asked Ambassador Oren the same thing yesterday, and he said he wrote a book about the 1967 war decades ago that said if you don't understand the 67 war, you won't understand the Middle East since then. Do you think this is a parallel event? If you don't understand the 12-day war, you're not going to understand the Middle East going forward?
I think so. You know, in the run up to the Six Day War, to follow Michael Oren has a doctorate from Princeton and wrote one of the great books. I mean, that is one of the great books on that war that people need to read from all sides. In other words, that's truly a great work of history. So just to pull from it a couple of things. In the run up to the war, in the days before the war, everybody understood war was coming, and nobody really understood how strong Israel is. Israelis did not understand how strong they are. The enemy had roughly the same technological level. They got planes and tanks from the Soviets. And then the war happened, and there was this astonishing discovery of our strength and our resilience and our capability. And that kind of arc, before the 67 war, they dug mass graves in Tel Aviv in expectation of that many dead. Something like 13,000 graves were dug in the biggest public park in the city. And then to discover that actually we could defeat the Egyptians and the Syrians and the Jordanians all at once in 6 days was an amazing discovery for people who were just 19 years out of being refugees from a Holocaust, people who in the previous, 19 years of Israel's existence had all fled or been forced to flee Iraq and Yemen and places like that. To suddenly discover that standing together on their own 2 feet, shoulder to shoulder, they were no longer vulnerable, and by their own strength and their own exertions. Iran has built an ideology of our destruction. It defines the regime. It spent hundreds of billions of dollars that the Iranian economy doesn't possess on our destruction. Our destruction had nothing to do with us. It has to do with an internal version of Shiism that this regime has tried to advance. And it's this big redemption arc of history that was going to prove that the regime is the redemption of Islam, blah, blah, blah. And they were coming for us, and we destroyed that capability and humiliated them in every way that they wanted to destroy us. And so, yes, there's absolutely that sense of coming out from a place of great danger to a kind of redemption.
Now, you take great lengths to put yourself in the boots of other people who are not necessarily friends of Israel or at least not allies of Israel. Can you imagine what Khamenei and his remaining clerics and generals are thinking right now? What do you think they must be considering their new situation in the world?
You know, at first I thought they must be just terribly humiliated. We did way too well in this war. We decapitated their security services, shattered. You know, the Israeli planes were in the skies over Iran, casually bombing the nuclear program and the missile factories. I mean, the casualness of it, because they had nothing that could seriously compete. We did not understand that Israeli planes had that capability until the last few months. We saw it first last October, but we really truly did not understand just how advanced the Israeli Air Force was compared to the Iranians. And I thought, they must just feel terribly humiliated. I mean, this undermines what the regime has posited as its raison d'etre, as its validation and justification for being essentially a dictatorship. And I have since come to another view from essentially listening to some very wise Shiites. And I have a podcast episode coming out soon in an interview with one of them, Hussein Abdul Hussein, where Iran's regime is a kind of revolution within Shia Islam that argues Shiites were always peaceful. They were always a minority in the Arab world. And so Arab Shia tended to always be, as minorities often are, not imperialist conquerors, but peaceful and preferring peace and avoiding political fights and avoiding political power, like the Druze and like the Alawites and like other minorities in the Middle East, and frankly, like Jews right up until the 20th century when they didn't have that option anymore. And Iran changed that. This regime is Shia imperialism that has adopted into Shiism, brought into Shiism from Sunni radicalism, from Sayyid Qutb. Ali Khamenei, the current supreme leader of Iran, translated the works of Ali Khamenei, of Sayyid Qutb, the man who is the intellectual inspiration for Al Qaeda, from Sunni Islam into Persian for use in Farsi, in this new Shiism that they invented. I have started to come to the belief that their great problem, they're not, it's not about us, it's not about being humiliated with us. They took Shiism and took it from a peaceful religion to a warmongering, conquering imperialist one, and that crashed and burned, and was defeated by the worst possible person to have defeated them, which is the Jews. And I think that in the internal discussion among Shia, the Persians have screwed this up for the Shia. And now I think that we're going to see, we've had 46 years of Iran pushing into Arab Shia communities, imposing themselves on Lebanese Shia through Hezbollah, imposing themselves on the Shia in Iraq. And now we're going to see a resurgence of Arab Shiism, which has always not been that conquering imperialism, and it's going to push back against the Iranians. So I think that there's now going to be that intra-Shia tension and contest. And I welcome it. I welcome it because I think we can make a lot of peace with a lot of Shia in the Middle East.
Interesting reference to Qutb. All I know about Qutb is what I read in The Looming Tower by Lawrence Wright, but I know that he went down fighting. He refused to treat with Sadat. He was hung by the neck until dead because he would not agree to anything. I imagine that's the Ayatollah Khamenei, but what I've been wondering about, Khrushchev was the supreme leader of the Soviet Union until one day he woke up and he wasn't, when the Soviet Union got tired of his antics in bringing them to the brink of destruction. Do you think that risk exists in a battered regime for Khamenei?
This is not my expertise. My guess from watching them just as a journalist for many years is no. If I think there are a great many people in the regime who think that the clerics generally have failed them. A lot of generals in the IRGC, a lot of people who are in the military side of Iran think that the clerics have led them into this humiliation and this collapse, and the economy is just doing catastrophically, and people are going hungry in one of the richest countries in the world with 10% of the world's oil. And so there's a sense of real deep failure by Khamenei himself and also the entire clerical elite that he leads. However, for everyone right now in power, the IRGC itself as a separate military, Khamenei is the symbol around which everyone organizes. If he falls, those generals fall as well, or at least a new instability comes in where nobody's quite clear. Khamenei represents the religious justification. He's the cleric in charge who is the deputy of the Messiah, the Mahdi who's to come. That is how Khomeini, his predecessor, defined the position of supreme leader. And if he falls, a lot of the internal regime story of its own validity, which is a religious validity, will fall with him. So I suspect that no matter how much the generals are angry and frustrated and even enraged that he led this profoundly ridiculous, incompetent, and wasteful imperialist foreign policy that only hurt Iran and bankrupted Iran, and then failed to actually hurt the Jews. No matter how much rage they have, if he falls, they do, and so they'll try and keep him in power.
Well, the only counter argument I can offer is that the IRGC generals look at the Ba'athist regimes that have fallen in Iraq and Syria. They had pretty good runs as police states. If they're willing to accept a police state that stays within its borders, there's no reason that the IRGC can't be rich and happy and stop threatening Israel and therefore stop funding proxies. I know it's a choice. It's an unlikely choice, but I like to think it's possible. And I don't know if anyone's talking about it in Israel. I don't know how you would notice it if they were trying to scale down. But has the regime's rhetoric, in your view, moderated at all since the shellacking they got in June?
The regime's rhetoric has not moderated one bit, including issuing a fatwa to kill President Donald Trump. But I would say that the regime's rhetoric has turned inward. In other words, what they're worried about now, for example, they did a great victory march, but at the victory march, they announced that all kinds of crazy, ridiculous things are now said on state media in Iran. A third of Tel Aviv is burned to the ground, and 1,000 Israelis are dead, and all these things that are just, they're signals of the scale of the humiliation and the scale of the political problem internally that this failure at war really means for that regime. So, no, it absolutely. When they were confident, we were the target of their insane rhetoric. Now that they're very fragile and feel very much beaten, the internal people of Iran are the target of that rhetoric. And so the rhetoric has changed, but it hasn't moderated. But to your point about how the military, all it would have to do was just be satisfied with running Iran, and then it could just live forever, and everybody would buy their oil, and they would be a rich country and have a great time. There's nothing about Iran that prevents it from being a Saudi Arabia. In terms of wealth, in terms of stability, in terms of religious government. Like they can have it all if they just stop trying to conquer everybody. And the simple answer is absolutely there are those kinds of questions being asked in Israel, but there are also those kinds of voices being raised within Iran's own ruling regime itself. We are seeing from the outside, there's talk about this in the intelligence services, and there's talk about this in the West, in Israel, and there's also talk about this at think tanks that follow this stuff very closely, that the tension that I mentioned between the generals and the clerics is very real. And for the clerics' fantasies, Iran has actually sacrificed a lot. And if that can be changed into what is basically just a military regime, everything would have gone better, and there would have been much lower cost, and Iran would be in a much better place. And I have to say, just as an Israeli, as the Muslims say, Inshallah, may it be God's will. An Iran that doesn't want to kill me, I don't care how they run themselves. I think that would be a beautiful contribution to a more stable Middle East. And by the way, it would lower oil prices for everybody because Iranian oil would be on the market.
And Iran could grow like it was growing at a GDP rate under the Shah again. And they've lost 45% of GDP over the last decade. They must be grindingly sick of being poor. Haviv, last question on this. I think June 2025 will go down as maybe one of the most significant weeks in the entire century. It certainly is the most significant week in the first 25 years of this century for the good. There have been terrible things, 9/11, 10/7, other terrorist attacks, wars, invasion. But this was really a good month all around. And before I move on to the problems in Gaza and the problems with your high court and the problem with your settlers, do you think that the thing we'll remember is the fact that this was the week in which the Iranian myth was shattered, that they were actually a superpower or a neo superpower?
Absolutely. It's a new Lebanon. It's a new Lebanon. The slow demolition of Iran's proxies, this wasn't a 12-day war with Iran. It was a 12-day air campaign in Iran that was the apex, the climax of a 20-month campaign that systematically dismantled one proxy after another, one capability after another by the Israelis. And over the course of those 20 months, Lebanon was freed from the grip of Hezbollah. Hezbollah might come back. It might take a 20-year arc. Lebanon might still fail. But the Lebanese army is slowly taking more and more control of the country. Lebanese politics are stabilizing and unifying, and that is thanks to the Israeli campaign against Iran. Syria is a whole new Syria because of the Israeli campaign against Iran. The entire Middle East sees what the Israelis did. The Iranians made the mistake of leaving us no choice. They told us again and again they are going to destroy us. And then on October 7, which was obviously Hamas, who are Sunni and Palestinian and not part of Iran's proxy system, but nevertheless are very much embedded in Iran's proxy system. They took money. One of the last generals Israel assassinated in Iran during those 12 days of war was a guy named Izadi, who was the head of the Palestine division of the Quds force of the Revolutionary Guards, meaning he was the guy coordinating October 7, coordinating with Hamas, coordinating the war on Israel from the Palestinian side. And he funded, he trained, he brought their fighters to Iran to help them train. He coordinated with Hezbollah to teach them a lot of the tactics and strategies that we saw on October 7. And he was one of the people taken out as well. So wherever you go in the Middle East, the Saudis, the Iraqis, Iraqi Shia, there was an election 4 years ago. It's not new, but it has just gone on overdrive, where Iraqi Shia rejected catastrophically for the Iranians the pro-Iran Shia factions. They dropped from 130 seats, I think, to 14 or something like that. And so everywhere you go in the Middle East, a rejection of Iranian imperialism, and now that Iran is that much weaker and all of its bluster is shattered, that is going on overdrive. They are no longer a factor. Bahrain is breathing easier. The entire Persian Gulf is breathing easier. The Saudis are breathing easier. And entire nations are coming out from under this shadow. It will be
another time we'll have to talk about Turkey,
by a lot of people.
Because I did listen to your podcast on Turkey, especially the second version when you got the audio fixed a little bit, and it leaves me profoundly uneasy. But I also think Erdogan will walk right up to a line, but he won't cross a line that gets him booted out of NATO. I do want to talk about June. So June 2025 is a peak moment for the good guys. The last two Haviv podcasts I've listened to are about very bad moments following that. The Gaza aid station having actually been the scene of civilians being shot by the IDF, overplayed by Haaretz. I thought your explanation of Haaretz was excellent today. But at the end of that podcast, you suggested that the IDF had fully embraced the idea that they have to protect and deliver the food efficiently as a strategic goal of the Gaza campaign. Is that widely shared point of view? Do other people agree with you on that they've embraced it?
The IDF has said publicly that it is fixing a lot of the things that have clearly been very wrong. And more than that, the attention of the Major General in charge of Southern Command, the Supreme Commander of the entirety of Southern Command of Israel, is now specifically focused, primarily focused, I would even say, on getting that right. So no, the IDF has not said outright what I said, which is that the Army understands and the Army has to fix this, and this has been a tremendous failure of strategy and attention and competence. But it has acted in ways that clarify that it gets it. And it's a shame that it took, the whole world noticing, and it's a shame that it took a few hundred dead. I doubt the numbers that are actually out there, but if the numbers are half that, that doesn't fundamentally change the moral questions, and it certainly doesn't change the tactical and strategic questions of the war and the terrible competence and incompetence and mistakes represented there. So, yes, the Army gets it. The Army gets that if you take aid away from Hamas, Hamas finally implodes. What's left of it does actually implode, and the Army understands that it has to get this right.
I thought when I was listening to you that the events of the last couple of weeks at the aid station were like our Abu Ghraib problem and scandal in the United States occupation of Iraq, something that obliterates every other headline. But I think Operation Rising Lion is sufficiently large and significant in world historical terms that this can be fixed, which brings me to the second issue. You were talking to Amanda Dan today in a different podcast about settler violence. Now, I never know how to qualify settler violence in terms of, is it 20 people, 200 people, 2,000 people in a nation of 10 million? And what significance should we attach to it? You just tell me what significance we should attach to it.
These are a group of incredibly fringe extremists who are deeply embarrassing to the vast majority, not of Israelis, not even of Israelis living over the Green Line, settlers, not even of religious Zionist settlers, which are maybe a quarter or a third of settlers at the most, not even of far right religious Zionist settlers, but even of their own supporters. These are people who actually kind of horrify the people who politically are generally predisposed to like them. You're talking about several hundred. It might be 2,000. It might be in the very low thousands. But you're talking about several hundred, mostly young people who are part of a political movement and religious movement that is deeply radicalized by Israeli political concessions and Israeli attempts at peacemaking and a sense that they can't stop Israel from every once in a while, pulling out of territory that they believe is absolutely promised by God and is part of the redemption of the world. And these are also tend to be people who come from broken homes and people who need the community and people who are radicalized for social reasons, not just for religious and political ones. And one of the things that they have been talking about for 30 years, this group, who are called by Israelis the youth of the hills, the Noar Gvaot, or sometimes called hilltop youth in English, who live in the most extremist sort of wildcat outposts that are, illegal under Israeli law, which does allow certain settlements, certain kinds of settlements. These are even under the Israeli law not allowed. This most radical of radical fringe of Israeli politics are people who think that the state of Israel has betrayed its own historic mission by not, for example, ethnically cleansing Palestinians en masse. And they believe that if ever the army cracks down on any kind of illegality in their particular kind of settlement outposts, that needs to be avenged. And how do you avenge a state that for Palestinians is willing to hurt Jews in their mind? You attack Palestinians. And so the attack on Palestinians that we've seen from these people, and which I have called terrorism, a burning of a house in a village, just you raid a village, burn down a house, and then walk away after, I don't know what, puncturing the tires of cars. There have been people wounded. There even have been, on very rare occasions, people killed. But nevertheless, it's mostly vandalism. But this is terrorism. Its purpose is terrorism. Its principle is terrorism. It's the FBI definition of what terrorism is. But it's a rebellion against the Israeli state as much as it is racist violence toward Palestinians. Now, this is a very sidelined group, but some of the people who are their supporters happen to be people in this coalition, which includes the most far-right party in the entirety of Israeli politics. And they tend to try to protect them at every turn. And so it's actually been a rising wave of their violence. Over the past, I think 2 weeks ago, they attacked a village, a Palestinian village. I came out and called them terrorism. A couple of people came out against me and said, how dare you, how could you, what a terrible thing to say about fellow Israelis. I'm not usually accused of being, a dyed-in-the-wool leftist, but these people did accuse me of that. And then a week later, these same youth were attacking Israeli soldiers. So in the last 3 days, there was a battalion 7114 of a reservist Israeli infantry battalion was carrying out an operation against a terror cell in Ramallah, including discovering their lab, their explosives lab, and destroying the explosives lab. Very much an act of protection of Israelis. And as they were either going to the operation, coming back from the operation, or patrolling around ahead of the operation, these kids, these extremists who are, they're adults. I mean, age-wise, we call them kids. We shouldn't. They're adults. Actually set down an ambush, a rock-throwing ambush for these soldiers. And soldiers were wounded. And they burned an installation of the army that tracks signals intelligence in the area. And the army started cracking down, and Israeli society really sort of woke up and noticed these people. It's been a very busy 20 months. It's been hard to notice everything. It's been hard to pay attention, but they're making it impossible to ignore. And I think that's a good thing because it's time we crack down on them. It is absolutely terrorism, and it should not exist, and the Israeli state knows how to deal with it.
So the obvious question, Israel can penetrate Iran to the level of everybody sitting around the table with the supreme leaders got to be wondering whether on their left or their right is a Mossad agent. How can Israel not know who these extremists are and take them into custody? They've got to know who they are.
They do. They do. Let me even say more than that. When we have partial intelligence on terror infrastructures and plans, the Israeli military, for decades now, 3, 4 decades, has used a very controversial practice called administrative detention, which is detaining for periods of months at a time Palestinians suspected of terrorism, but that don't have enough evidence that you could bring to a civil court and actually put them on trial for actual crimes. And it's obviously a very problematic thing because they're sitting in jail and this thing gets renewed every 6 months and they could be in jail for years. Now, I have written against it a lot, quite a bit. My dad debated these things as a lawyer who was cited a couple times by the Israeli Supreme Court 40 years ago on these questions. But the problem with administrative detention is really simple. It works. In other words, you have 15 terror attacks in a certain area, whether it's inside the Green Line or it's in the West Bank somewhere. You have terror attacks. You kind of know who it is because you kind of get a lot of signals intelligence and a lot of personal human intelligence from the population. And you can arrest them and stop the terrorism, or you can wait till you have a police level civil court, right, evidence. If you do the administrative detention, the terrorism all goes away. When administrative detention is used, the terrorism disappears. It works. And that's the tragedy of it because it's hugely problematic, but it works. My suggestion is very simple, and I'm really going to be coming out. I believe in solving problems. If it works, it works. Let's use it. There's no reason not to use it. These people attack soldiers. These people are in a full-fledged, public, open rebellion against the state of Israel. They are hurting Palestinian civilians, totally innocent Palestinian civilians. This is not, attacks of revenge attacks. There's one village there's Jews living next to Arabs, and they are carrying on revenge attacks against each other. And then you need to call in the police and social workers and figure it out. That's not what this is. This is attacking Palestinians as part of hurting the Israeli state. This is attacking soldiers and part of a rebellion against the Israeli state. And I think we should begin to consider using administrative detention against them. It's something that hasn't been completely unknown, but it's not a practice that's easily done for Israelis. And I think that if we do administrative detention in principle on terrorism, it can be useful. It can be useful here.
Yeah, we can't do that in the United States against Antifa because we are blessed by due process protections. But I'm sometimes aghast at the fact that we do not allow the most extreme elements in the United States, or we allowed the most extreme elements in the United States to go about their craziness uninhibited. Last question or set of questions, Haviv. This past weekend, Bob Vylan at the big music Glastonbury Festival went on a death to the IDF, kill the IDF series of chants. I've never heard of this guy before. I doubt I'll ever hear of him again. There are two of them apparently, and it's a moniker. It's not their name. But my friend Dennis Prager is recovering from a bad injury, so I can't ask him. How do you think a rapper from Britain who's not Muslim, as far as I can tell, picks up on the idea to become an anti-Semite up there with any level of anti-Semitism possible?
I mean, it's the ideology that we've come to know and love, right? Of this very radical, anti-Western, post-colonial, all of these titles. I guess we'll call them woke. I don't know what we call them. There was another singer on the stage who just said, it's something like, she was terribly hurt by the fact that she's white and she is an oppressor and she's, evil and her being whitey. Well, that's something we should talk about. That was her word. Her word was whitey. And she just had this from everyone again and again and again. This version of the left, everywhere it exists in the West, this anti-Western left, has become more and more rabid, more and more radicalized. I just now today saw you had a protest in San Francisco, dikes for something, maybe Palestine, or it was Dykes for something. That was the sign. That was the huge banner they held up, Dykes for something, and it had the Hamas upside down red triangle that they put on soldiers that they are targeting Israeli soldiers in their videos. In other words, we're about to kill you. Now, for an LGBT march to thrill to Hamas's bloodlust, I think is interesting. It takes explaining. It's the culture that's happening. It is a collapse of this whole culture, and you see it, and you see it, all over the place. What was interesting to me, by the way, is that this guy didn't just lead a chant of death to the IDF. I'll put it this way: he's right. If he wants the Jews to go, if he wants the Israelis to disappear, you do need to get the IDF out of the way. He's not wrong.
Huh.
And the IDF, by the way, it can take it. He's not the first and he's not the last who thinks death to the IDF. The whole point of the IDF is, come and try. What was interesting to me was before he started leading a chant death to the IDF, he talked about his Jewish producer who got him started. And he didn't say Jewish, he said Zionist. And he said this Zionist fellow. And he started cursing him with curses related to women's genitalia and talking about how he's bald. And we have these Zionists in our lives that we have to tolerate. Now, I submit to you that this man is very frustrated, that something about his musical career he owes to some Jew in England. I don't know who this guy is, but Zionist? Really? A Zionist music producer? That was your problem? That he was not that he started your career, but that he's a Zionist? So first there's the anti-Semitic rant. Then there's the death to the IDF. But none of us should, be worried about this, right? Look, I'm Israeli. I don't care what this guy chants. I care. This is not the end of Israel. This is not the beginning of the end of Israel. This is not remotely a danger to Israel. This is a terrible danger to Britain. This is British society, British politics, British ideas, British discourse imploding into this nihilistic insanity. And that's the only danger. And the fact that
that's the same danger in New York,
that
Haviv,
way,
with Mamdani.
yeah.
The problem with
But I'm
Mamdani
worried
is
for the
that
Jews. I'm worried for the Jews of Britain. I'm not worried for the Israelis or the IDF because of how he talked while chanting death to the IDF is the permissible way to package, ew, yuck, I had a Jewish producer. That's where the real danger is.
and it will spread. But I do think there's also an outer limit. Now, let's close on this. I think that Mamdani is not going to win in New York because I think everyone's going to figure out he's a whack job and he's an anti-Semite. That's my opinion. He hasn't confessed to that, but I think all the evidence is there that he's an anti-Semite. Do you think he represents a particularly important moment in American political history for Jewish Americans? Because if he wins, that's the most prevalent anti-Semite in America in a major political position in my lifetime, if he wins.
I suspect you'd have a better answer than me. I can't help but look at it from an Israeli perspective. The fact that he won't just say globalize the Intifada is death, is a call for killing. Now, is every single person going to, semantically deconstruct that term to mean let's kill Jews? No. But he now, the poor grandmother from Colorado who was burned by the attack some weeks ago and passed away today, and he put out a statement, expressing that he's heartbroken about it, but he couldn't mention that she was attacked while basically demonstrating for the hostages, and he couldn't mention that she was Jewish, and he couldn't mention his own anti-Zionism. He is a supporter of the BDS movement and has once said that BDS, which is an argument that Israel shouldn't exist, not an argument that Israel should change its policies, is what brought him to the Democratic Socialist Party. So this is someone consumed to some significant extent with the question of the demolition and removal of Israel. And a woman demonstrating for Israel is murdered by an Arab immigrant who is working off of the Arab anti-Semitic discourses on Israel. And the most he can say is that he's heartbroken that hatred could be in our streets. To which my feeling as an Israeli was, screw you. But I don't want to speak for, New York Jews. I just to say it was unbelievably Orwellian to hear him talk that way without actually mentioning the actual thing she actually was and the thing that killed her. If you talk about globalizing the Intifada or won't condemn talking about globalizing the Intifada, 1,000 Jews were killed in the second Intifada on that banner of Intifada. Don't talk to another Jew killed on the banner of Intifada and still refuse to notice that it's about Intifada and that it's exactly within that context. He should have kept his mouth shut at the very least.
Well said. Last question, got nothing to do with serious stuff, except you've got children. One of them is a young teenager. How do they feel after Operation Rising Lion? Did they take pride in it? Do they understand what the country did?
Yes, absolutely. And they have family members who are in the war. And when you're a kid, it's exciting. And when you're in it as an adult, it's terrifying. And that's as it should be. They feel safe
That
enough that they can get excited.
it will be interesting long term what the impact of that is to take down Tehran that thoroughly, that completely, and that quickly. Haviv Rettig Gur, his podcast is Ask Haviv Anything. You should listen to this week's edition on conditions in Gaza and the Times of Israel podcast with Amanda Dan talking about other pressing issues in the Israeli politic. But right now, we wanted to focus on Iran, and we did. Thank you, Aviv, for your time. I look forward to talking to you next month.